The settlers used to say the forest changed after sunset, that the moment the last streak of daylight slipped behind the ridge, something ancient woke between the trees. By 1857, no one traveled the northern trails alone, not after the disappearances began. Women who knew the woods like the backs of their hands vanished within sight of familiar landmarks, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Some claimed the wind carried voices when the moon was thin, gentle whispers calling from somewhere deep in the timberline. Others insisted they saw movement that didn't match the sway of branches or the scampering of animals, shapes far too large to be anything natural. Most dismissed it all as superstition, yet no one could explain the survivor who staggered out of the thicket one winter morning, her clothes torn, her hair matted with dirt and pine needles. She collapsed in the road, trembling so violently the doctor struggled to calm her. When she finally managed to speak, her voice cracked into a raw whisper. They were 7 feet tall, 3 of them, the same face, the same eyes. She died before she could say anything more. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she had been attacked by escaped convicts. Others whispered about old legends, the story of 3 brothers born during a brutal storm, infants so unnaturally large that people believed the forest itself had its eyes on them. Their parents had vanished weeks later, and the children were presumed dead, but the woods had a way of keeping secrets. The older folks remembered the cries heard at night for months afterward, strange, layered sounds that echoed through the ravines. No one ever went to look. As the number of missing women climbed, the whispers turned into dread. Tracks began appearing near the creek, each footprint the size of a man's chest, spaced in long strides that no creature should be capable of. And every so often, travelers would swear they heard someone following them, keeping pace just out of sight, breathing slow and steady like a sleeping giant. Those who stayed behind in the settlements spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the windows after dark, because sometimes, when all else was silent, 3 low voices hummed in perfect unison somewhere in the distant, moonless woods, waiting, learning, listening. Strange disappearances began quietly at first, almost too subtly for anyone to notice. A woman heading to visit her sister in the next settlement never arrived, her horse wandering back alone with the saddle strap torn as if yanked violently. A young widow collecting firewood was last seen near the bend in the river, her basket later discovered overturned, the apples inside crushed and scattered across the mud. People tried to explain it away as misfortune, accidents, or the work of animals, but the pattern grew too sharp, too precise to ignore. Each missing woman vanished along the northern edge of the forest, always near dusk, always within a narrow stretch of land that locals had long regarded with uneasy respect. This was the part of the woods where even the bravest hunters claimed the canopy felt heavier, the air dense with a kind of watchful silence. Folks often said stepping into the timberline felt like trespassing on ground that didn't belong to people anymore. As more women disappeared, fear began to erode daily life. No one dared let their daughters walk alone, and even married women avoided going out without their husbands by their side. The church tried to calm the town with sermons about faith and God's protection, but whispered conversations beneath the pews told a different story. Some believed supernatural forces were at work, spirits angered by settlers, creatures of folklore awakened by the logging crews, or something ancient buried beneath the soil. Yet what disturbed people most were the details left behind, scraps of cloth hanging high in branches as if placed there deliberately, deep gouges carved into tree trunks, and strange symbols drawn in the dirt that no one recognized. Animals avoided the area entirely, creating an eerie stillness that made the forest seem hollow and lifeless. At night, dogs howled without reason, and households kept their lamps burning longer, afraid of what might move outside once the world turned dark. Rumors, once dismissed as idle talk, began shaping into something more chilling. Travelers reported hearing footsteps alongside the trail even when they saw no one. Others claimed they caught glimpses of tall shadows shifting behind the trees, too large and too silent to belong to any man. The sheriff organized small patrols, but they found nothing, no footprints that made sense, no campsites, no signs of struggle except for the strange, deliberate clues that felt less like accidents and more like warnings. By late autumn, the disappearances had woven themselves into the town's daily conversations, settling heavy over meals, prayers, and sleepless nights. People sensed something watching them, something patient and methodical, studying their routines as though preparing for its next move. The woods had become a threshold of dread, and the fear that gripped the community felt like the slow tightening of unseen hands around their throats, leaving them wondering who would be taken next and why the forest had suddenly grown hungry. The whispering trees became the most unsettling part of the growing mystery, not because anyone could prove what they heard, but because everyone who stepped near the northern timberline described the same impossible phenomenon. It began as a soft hum, a faint vibration carried through the branches that almost resembled wind, except on nights when the air was still and the leaves didn't move. Those who listened closely claimed they could make out layered tones, like several voices speaking at once but muffled, distant, and strangely rhythmic. The whispers always came after nightfall, weaving through the forest like a disembodied murmur that seemed to travel from tree to tree. Some settlers insisted it was just imagination fueled by fear, yet more than one hunter admitted they turned back from the woods after hearing what sounded like a child calling for help, the voice thin and trembling as if echoing from somewhere deep underground. The sound itself played tricks on the mind, shifting direction without warning, sometimes drifting from the canopy above and other times rising from the ground beneath the roots. Dogs refused to approach the area, growling with their fur standing on end whenever families ventured too close. Women hanging laundry near the edge of their yards froze mid-motion, certain they heard someone whisper their names from the shadows. What unsettled them most was how familiar these whispers sometimes felt, like the voices of loved ones long gone or friends who lived miles away. A few men who had lost wives or sisters to the disappearances claimed they heard those same voices calling them at dusk, pleading in tones that sounded so heartbreakingly real they nearly ran into the forest without thinking. Only after the spell broke did they realize the voice carried no warmth or humanity, just an eerie mimicry, as though something was learning how people spoke by listening in the dark. Stories spread that the trees themselves were speaking, passing along secrets through the groaning of old branches and the sighing of the underbrush. Woodcutters refused to work near that part of the forest after one man dropped his axe and fled home pale as snow, swearing he heard three voices whispering in perfect unison just inches behind him despite no one being there. Elders in the settlement recalled older generations mentioning the woods as a place where sound traveled strangely, but even they admitted this was different, darker, intentional. The whispers felt too focused, too aware, as if they weren't random noises but a form of communication waiting to be understood. Night after night, the strange chorus continued, carrying with it the chilling sense that the forest wasn't merely haunted by sound, it was alive with something listening, learning, and perhaps calling out to lure its next victim. The survivor who emerged from the woods became the turning point that shattered every comforting lie the settlement had been telling itself. Before her appearance, people clung to explanations that felt manageable: wild animals, bandits, accidents, anything grounded in the world they understood. But when the woman stumbled out of the tree line just after dawn, barefoot and shaking uncontrollably, all those fragile theories shattered. She was a young mother from a nearby homestead, missing for nearly 7 days. Her clothes were torn in ragged strips, as if something had pulled at them with brute force. Her skin was scratched and bruised, yet none of the injuries looked like ordinary assaults. Long, parallel marks ran across her arms, not claw marks, not rope burns, something in between, as though large hands had gripped her too tightly. Her hair was filled with twigs, mud, and clumps of moss, and her eyes held a glazed, unfocused terror that suggested she had seen something her mind was refusing to process. When the doctor and several neighbors tried to question her, she recoiled from every voice, pressing her back against the wall like a cornered animal. She barely seemed to recognize where she was, flinching at shadows, jerking her head toward the windows whenever a breeze brushed past them. It took hours before she could form even a single coherent sentence. Her lips trembled, and her voice cracked into a rasping whisper that sounded nothing like the woman her neighbors remembered. All she managed to say was that they were tall, so tall that she could see their faces only when they bent down close to her. She repeated the word 3, tapping her fingers against her knee with desperate insistence. Her description made no sense to anyone listening: identical faces staring down at her, identical voices humming in the dark, identical footsteps shaking the ground. No one dared ask her what they had done to her, because she tightened her hands into fists until her knuckles bled whenever someone came close to that question. She refused food, pushed away blankets, and fought sleep as though terrified of dreaming. The doctor claimed she was delirious, suffering from exposure and shock, but even he could not explain the strange, sweet-smelling residue on her clothes or the long, coarse strands of hair tangled around her wrists, hair far too light, far too thick, and far too long to belong to any ordinary person. She died within 2 days, her breathing shallow and erratic, her gaze fixed on a corner of the room as though she saw something no one else could. After her passing, the settlement grew quiet, every whispered conversation circling back to her final, trembling words. She was the first to return from the woods, and her terror carried a message no one wanted to accept: whatever was taking the women was still out there, still watching, and no longer afraid to let its presence be known. The resurfacing of the old legends began quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the townspeople feared that speaking them aloud would give them power again. The elders were the first to murmur about it, exchanging uneasy glances whenever someone mentioned the height of the figures the survivor described. These were stories most had heard as children, tales meant to frighten them away from wandering too deep into the woods, nothing more than superstition or frontier folklore. Yet the disappearances, the whispers, and now the survivor's final words forced everyone to reconsider them with a seriousness that felt like swallowing ice. The legend spoke of a brutal winter storm nearly 20 years before, one that had buried homesteads and livestock under mountains of snow. During that storm, a woman gave birth to triplets in a small cabin near the northern ridge. The midwife who delivered them claimed she had never seen infants so large, their limbs thick and their eyes disturbingly alert even moments after birth. The story went that the father refused to let anyone else see the boys, shutting the door on the midwife and insisting the children simply needed rest. For weeks after, neighbors heard strange sounds from the cabin, humming that was too deep for newborns, rhythmic thumps that rattled the windows, and cries that seemed to echo in layers. Then, without warning, the family vanished. Some said the father lost his mind and fled with the children into the forest. Others believed something in those woods was drawn to the infant's unnatural strength and size. A few whispered a far darker version, that the boys were never fully human, that their mother had seen something in the woods during her pregnancy and the storm was merely a cover for whatever presence had claimed them. The search party that went looking for the family found only the remains of the cabin, its walls splintered from the inside as if something had pushed outward with tremendous force. Snowdrifts around the house bore enormous impressions, not footprints exactly, but depressions too large, too widely spaced, too heavy to belong to any animal. The investigation ended abruptly. No bodies were found, no clues, nothing but the sense that the forest had swallowed the family whole. Over time, the legend faded, reduced to a warning told around fireplaces to keep children from wandering too far. But the elders never forgot. And when the survivor spoke of 3 identical faces bending over her, the old fear returned with icy clarity. What if the triplets had never died? What if the forest had raised them instead, molding them into something feral, something colossal, something that imitated human behavior only well enough to lure women deeper into its grasp? The idea seemed impossible, yet with every new disappearance, the legend felt less like a story and more like a prophecy that had finally clawed its way back into the present. The formation of the search party marked the moment when fear finally hardened into action, though every man who volunteered did so with a heaviness in his voice, as if he already sensed he might not return. By the time the 5th woman vanished, the settlement could no longer cling to hope or excuses. Mothers kept their children indoors, men sat awake all night with rifles laid across their knees, and the church bell rang not for worship but for emergency gatherings. The sheriff, a man who had always prided himself on logic and calm, stood before the townsfolk with his head clutched in both hands, admitting that whatever was happening in the northern woods was beyond anything he had ever encountered. It was no longer a matter of searching for missing women but of confronting something unknown, something that seemed to study the town as carefully as the townsfolk now studied the tree line. Despite their fear, a group of 16 men stepped forward, husbands, brothers, neighbors, each driven by someone they had lost or someone they feared would disappear next. They packed ropes, lanterns, rifles, and food for several days, though more than one man muttered that they doubted they would need supplies for that long. On the morning they set out, the sky hung low with thick, colorless clouds, as though the forest itself was hiding the sun. The moment they crossed into the northern trail, the air shifted. Birds stopped singing, the underbrush stilled, and a heavy quiet settled over the group, a silence so complete that even their footsteps sounded muffled. They moved deeper, following the tracks that had been reported earlier, prints that resembled oversized human footsteps, stretched unnaturally long, each indentation pressed several inches into the soil. The deeper they went, the stranger the woods became. Trees leaned inward unnaturally, as if shaped by wind blowing in a single direction for decades, and the ground was marked by scratches that spiraled around trunks like crude signatures carved with enormous hands. One of the men noticed hair snagged on a branch, thick, pale, and nearly 2 feet long. Another found a crude structure of stacked stones, small enough to be built by hand yet arranged with unsettling purpose. At first, they kept their voices low so they wouldn't startle whatever was out there, but soon their silence shifted from caution to instinct, as though speaking aloud might draw something toward them. As they followed the trail to a deeper ravine, a scent drifted through the air, sweet and earthy, almost like wildflowers mixed with decay. It was unlike anything any of them had smelled before, both inviting and repulsive at the same time. The sheriff raised his hand to halt the group, his face pale, his breath caught halfway in his throat. They all sensed it then, they were no longer searching blindly. Something had noticed them. Something enormous. Something intelligent. And it was waiting just ahead, hidden in the stillness of the trees. The discovery of the hollow clearing marked the moment when the search party understood that whatever they were following was not merely living in the woods, it was thriving there, building, shaping, and marking territory with a disturbing awareness of how to instill fear. After hours of trekking through twisting ravines and uneven trails, they reached an area where the forest suddenly thinned out, forming a perfect circle of open ground. The men paused at the edge, sensing immediately that the place was wrong. No wind moved through it. No birds nested in the branches above. Even the insects seemed to avoid the clearing, leaving an unnatural quiet that pressed against their ears. The sheriff stepped forward first, lantern raised, and the beam of light fell across a primitive structure that made several men recoil. Woven between the trees were lattices of branches and bones tied together with strips of leather or hair, forming walls without rooms, shapes without purpose, and symbols no one could decipher. It looked like a crude dwelling that had been constructed by something with strength far beyond human but with a grotesque imitation of human intention. The bones were the worst part. They were everywhere, small animal bones, larger ones that didn't quite match any species the men recognized, and hair braided around them in long, twisted ropes. Some bones had been sharpened into spikes and hammered into tree trunks in patterns that spiraled upward. Other sets were arranged in precise circles on the ground, as though marking territory or honoring something ancient. At the center of the clearing lay a mound covered in furs, feathers, and cloth torn from dresses, unmistakably belonging to some of the missing women. The realization sank slowly over them, settling in their stomachs like ice. One of the men knelt to examine the mound and found long fingernail marks etched into the dirt beneath it, as though someone had been dragged or held there desperately. Every step around the clearing revealed more unsettling details: tufts of pale, coarse hair snagged on low branches, footprints large enough to swallow a man's boot, and carvings of 3 elongated figures etched into the bark of multiple trees, their arms extended, their eyes hollow and staring. It was clear that they had stumbled upon the heart of the Triplets' territory, a place shaped not with human logic but with some primal instinct. The structures were not random but organized, arranged in a way that suggested rituals, habits, or communication. Several men whispered that the clearing felt like a nest, a place where creatures returned repeatedly, layering debris and trophies over the years. The strange sweet scent that had followed them earlier grew stronger here, heavy and cloying, making their skin crawl. Some felt watched, others felt surrounded, and all silently agreed that stepping into the clearing had crossed an invisible threshold. The forest no longer felt like a forest. It felt like a mind, and they had wandered directly into the center of it. As dusk crept over the trees and the clearing dimmed into an eerie half-light, the men began to feel the unmistakable sensation that they were no longer alone. At first it was subtle, a shift in the air, a faint pressure along their spines, the prickle of being watched by something intelligent and patient. The lanterns flickered as if reacting to a presence rather than the wind, and even the bravest among them felt their throats tighten. Then, one of the men, a hunter with sharper eyes than most, pointed toward the tree line with a trembling hand. At first no one saw anything. Then the shadows grew clearer, sharpening into shapes that did not belong to branches or shifting light. 3 silhouettes stood just beyond the ring of trees, tall enough that their heads nearly brushed the lower limbs, unmoving yet radiating a presence that made the clearing feel suddenly suffocating. What struck the men first was not the height but the stillness. These figures didn't sway. They didn't shift weight. They simply stood, as if carved from the darkness itself. When one of the lanterns swung slightly, its beam swept across the nearest silhouette just long enough to catch the glint of something pale, skin stretched tight over enormous limbs, hair hanging in thick ropes down its back, eyes reflecting light like a predator's. The figures did not retreat or roar or attack, instead, they observed, silent and deliberate. Each movement was too controlled, too practiced, too synchronized. One of them tilted its head, and the other 2 followed a heartbeat later, mirroring the gesture perfectly. The men realized with a cold jolt that these creatures weren't guessing or reacting, they were studying them in a way that felt uncomfortably human. A soft hum began to rise from the darkness, so low it was almost below hearing. The men felt it more than they heard it, vibrating faintly in their bones. Then, layered through the hum, came a rhythm of breath, 3 deep, slow inhalations, rising and falling in unison, like a single entity controlling 3 bodies. Every man in the clearing felt the hair on his arms stand on end as he understood that these were the same breaths the survivor must have heard in the dark, the same voices that drifted through the trees at night. The hum grew slightly louder, and one of the figures took a step forward, the stride unnervingly long, the footfall so soft it made no sound. The clearing seemed to shrink with that single movement, the forest closing around them with a silent, crushing inevitability. The sheriff whispered for the men not to run, though his voice broke on the last word. The figures didn't chase or rush. They simply began to advance in a slow, deliberate arc, positioning themselves in a way that suggested control, dominance, and a terrifying familiarity with how to corner prey. The realization settled over the men like a death sentence: these were not mindless creatures. They were hunters who understood fear, who had been waiting for the search party to come, who were now stepping into view not by accident, but by invitation. The moment the soft, feminine voices drifted through the trees, the men felt a paralysis that had nothing to do with exhaustion. It began as a faint murmur from somewhere deep within the forest, gentle, familiar, almost comforting. The kind of sound a mother might use to soothe a frightened child or a sister might whisper when calling someone home. At first, the men thought the wind was playing tricks on them again, carrying echoes from their imagination. But then one of them stiffened, his face draining of color as he whispered his missing wife's name. The voice calling to him matched hers perfectly, tone, rhythm, even the little tremble she had when speaking his name in fear or worry. Another man heard his daughter's voice, soft and pleading, echoing from a direction where no one stood. Soon the clearing filled with an unsettling chorus of familiar tones, each one crafted precisely enough to tug at the deepest parts of memory and grief. What made the voices truly terrifying was not their mimicry alone but their precision. They didn't call randomly or repeat nonsense. They whispered the names of specific men. They used specific intonations. They spoke phrases only those men's loved ones would know. One voice pleaded, "Come help me, please," in the exact inflection a missing sister had used years before during an accident on the farm. Another murmured a lullaby only one man's wife ever sang. The effect was immediate. The forest no longer felt like emptiness but like a stage built to manipulate the heart, crafted by something that understood human bonds enough to exploit them. A few men took hesitant steps toward the sound, unable to fight the instinctive pull. They weren't thinking about danger anymore, they were thinking about hope. What if their loved ones were alive? What if they were injured and calling out for rescue? The sheriff tried to shout for them to stop, but his voice was smothered by the rising tide of whispers. The voices overlapped, layered in mimicry so perfect it felt impossible to resist. Each plea was timed to align with a man's weakest memory, as though the forest had been listening for days, learning the deepest vulnerabilities of every person who entered. The men who stepped away from the group vanished into the fog almost instantly, swallowed by the undergrowth before anyone could reach them. The others could only stand helplessly as the voices grew brighter, sweeter, more urgent, coaxing them deeper into the dark. It became sickeningly clear that the triplets were not hunting by force alone. They hunted through imitation, through emotional manipulation so exact it felt supernatural. The voices weren't echoes of the missing women, they were lures crafted to perfection, woven from the triplets' uncanny ability to mimic human speech. And with every step the men took toward the sound, the forest closed behind them, sealing their fate with a whisper. The first true confrontation came with a kind of horrifying clarity, a moment when every doubt, every whispered suspicion, every uneasy dream the men had been pushing away solidified into one undeniable truth. After several of their group vanished toward the deceptive voices, the remaining men gathered in a tight cluster, lanterns trembling in their hands. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the clearing until all that remained visible was a shrinking circle of earth beneath their feet. That was when the shadows at the tree lean deepened once more, and the triplets stepped forward, not as silhouettes this time, but as towering, unmistakably physical beings whose presence seemed to warp the very air around them. The men froze, unable to speak, unable even to move, as the three colossal figures emerged into the lantern glow one deliberate step at a time. Their height was the first thing that struck the men, 7.5 feet at the very least, their frames monstrously elongated yet disturbingly human in proportion. Their skin was pale in a way that suggested they rarely saw sunlight, stretched thin over thick, powerful muscles. Their hair hung in matted ropes down their backs and chests, streaked with dirt, leaves, and strands of something that looked too much like human hair. But their faces were the worst part. Each one was nearly identical, as if sculpted from the same template: high cheekbones, sunken cheeks, deep-set eyes that reflected the lantern light with an animalistic sheen. Their expressions were void of recognizable emotion, yet something about their gaze conveyed a predatory intelligence. When they blinked, they did so slowly, all three at the same moment, as though their minds operated in a shared rhythm. The men tried to aim their rifles, but their hands shook too violently to hold steady. The triplet in the center tilted its head, and the others mirrored the motion instantly, a synchronized gesture that felt impossibly unnatural. Then came the sound, a low, layered hum that vibrated the ground itself. It wasn't a growl or a snarl but something deeper, like a resonant chord played inside the earth. The men felt it in their chests rather than with their ears, a signal that felt more like a command or a warning than a threat. The triplets moved closer, their steps so soft they seemed to glide rather than walk, yet each movement radiated strength capable of snapping bone without effort. One of the men finally fired his rifle, the shot cracking through the clearing like lightning. But the figure he aimed at shifted with startling speed, the bullet tearing through nothing but mist. The triplets didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't so much as acknowledge the attack. Instead, the one on the left opened its mouth just slightly, and from deep within its throat came a perfect imitation of the man's wife calling his name, as though mocking the emotional lure it had used moments before. That was when panic surged through the group. They understood, too late, that these beings were not simply strong, they were calculated, sentient predators capable of learning, adapting, and using human emotion as a weapon. The clearing erupted into chaos. Lanterns fell, boots slipped on mud, branches snapped as men tried to flee in every direction. But the triplets didn't chase immediately, instead, they watched the explosion of fear with eerie stillness, as though observing prey scatter was part of their ritual. And only when the men broke the boundary of the clearing did the giants begin to move, swift and silent, vanishing into the dark with terrifying precision, ready to hunt them one by one. The 10th key point focuses on the strange aftermath that unfolded once the final pieces of the story came to light, a period marked not by relief but by an eerie quiet that settled over the town like fog refusing to lift. People who had once whispered boldly now lowered their voices even further, as if speaking too loudly might awaken whatever forces had been disturbed. The house at the center of the event stood untouched, doors still hanging crooked, windows dark, and the yard swallowed by weeds that grew impossibly fast, as though nourished by things unseen. Locals swore they heard soft knocks from inside at night, not violent or frantic but measured, rhythmic, and too intentional to dismiss as the building settling. Some believed it was just memory clinging to the structure, while others said it was something, or someone, trying to finish what had been interrupted. When the investigation files were reviewed, the officials found inconsistencies that no one could explain, written statements that didn't match earlier drafts, photographs that appeared slightly altered from the originals, and dates that seemed to shift by a day or two depending on who handled the documents. A deputy who had been present during the early searches was said to have woken his family multiple times screaming about lantern lights moving through the hallways even though no lanterns had been used. Visitors who tried to explore the property never stayed long, often returning to town pale and shaken, mumbling about shadows that moved in ways shadows should not. One group insisted they heard footsteps trailing behind them, matching their pace exactly, stopping only when they stopped, resuming the moment they took another step. The town council attempted to fence off the land, but the posts were always found leaning or uprooted the next morning no matter how deep they had been driven into the soil. Elders began insisting that the story was never meant to be reopened, that some histories cling too tightly to be handled safely. A few families abruptly left town, claiming they felt a heaviness settling over their homes since the truth had resurfaced. Those who remained agreed silently not to mention the events unless absolutely necessary, but the silence itself became its own form of acknowledgement, a shared understanding that the past had not truly ended. Even travelers passing through remarked that the air seemed strange when they approached the town line, like walking into a place holding its breath. And though everyone tried to resume normal life, the sense persisted that something was still watching from the abandoned property, waiting for someone to make the mistake of looking back too long.